time. So congratulations to all of you, and welcome to the quarterfinals of the 2021 Regents Cup competition. Hope you all had a good lunch and good inspiration from the speaker. And as we know, this is an opportunity to hold a Oxford-style debate, and the topic relates to free speech. Your prompt today is this. There are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. This will be an interesting topic. I'm going to explain to you the phases of this debate, and then I'm going to introduce our esteemed judges. There will be 3 rounds in this debate. In the first, we will hear opening statements presented by one student from each team, the affirmative team and the negative team. And then in the second round, the teams will engage in cross-examination. I'll kick off the cross-examination, and then you all are welcome to banter back and forth. And any one of the judges that would like to enter the chat box and ask for the floor to throw in a question is welcome to do that. And in the final round, one member of each team will present your closing statements. And then at the conclusion of the debate, all of our judges, who are now well trained on our scoring system, will enter and complete their scores, and the results of this round will be quickly tabulated so that the victors can move on to the semifinals. So I'd like to now introduce our panel of judges for this quarterfinal round. First, we have Keith Allred. If you want to wave or acknowledge Keith. Keith's the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. Secondly, the Honorable Pam Gates, who is the Chief Presiding Judge of the Maricopa County Superior Court. Glad you're all meeting her in this environment and not in her court. And we may have Vince Leach, Senator of the Arizona Legislature. There he is. Vince, glad you could join us here. And then
I finally found the right button.
Yeah, I know the rooms are a little nondescript. And now Michael Polyakov, the president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. And last but not least, Doug Weiser, University of Miami Alumni Association Board of Directors. And I'm Ann Mariucci, and I'm a former regent for the Arizona Board of Regents. So thank you to everybody. Judges, just reminding us all that we should be objective and unbiased as we listen and score the round. The score should reflect who we think makes the better argument. And students, before we begin, just note that I'll give you a 1-minute hand signal when each round is about to wrap up, and then officially announce the end of the round. But I'll be keeping time, but you'll be keeping time as well. And you can give, I will give you a 1-minute hand signal as we about to end that round. So we wish you all the best of luck, and we're very excited to hear from you all today. So we'll start with the opening statement in the affirmative, and we'll look at 6 to 7 minutes for that. Is it Alyssa or Cameron?
It'll be me.
Okay, Cameron, welcome.
Just before I get started, I want to thank everybody for attending this round, and we really appreciate you're here. This couldn't happen without you guys and my opponents. Let's have a good debate. The banning of texts within schools has a lengthy history. Traditionally, texts are banned due to ideological and religious grounds, which typically bans books with LGBT or feminist themes, those written by BIPOC authors, or involving comprehensive sexual health education. Traditional banning disproportionately affects minority groups, and thus serves to reinforce the oppression of those groups and promotes the spreading of false or incomplete information. This sort of banning is harmful, and we as the affirmative do not endorse it. However, the affirmative does support a new sort of banning, and the banning of texts that are truly offensive in nature. We are sure the negation will agree that schools have a duty to protect their students and foster an inclusive learning environment where all students are safe. That is not the discussion today. However, we will be debating that there are texts out there that perpetrate harmful content to students, racial stereotypes, abuse, discrimination, and more. These texts are inappropriate for school environments and do more harm than good. There are more effective ways to teach about sensitive topics than allowing offensive texts to be taught in the classroom. Before I get started, we're going to go over some quick definitions for this debate. The affirmative talks about texts in the definition that they are written material used within course content. We define offensive as inaccurate, incomplete, and uncritical of the dominant American narrative. We define banned as to exclude or prohibit from classroom use by the school board. And finally, the affirmative defines curriculum as the public school system's lists of texts implemented in classroom teaching. Now, this also encompasses health education. Into our first contention. Offensive texts promote learned biases and reinforce outdated values, especially because they exclude minority groups and histories. Offensive texts reinforce biases based on the dominant cultural values. There are many instances of our history classes omitting essential information about minority groups and whitewashing the American narrative. People of color. Slavery and indigenous genocide was either ended earlier than reality or never occurred according to our curriculum. As we know, this is not true. Thanksgiving as historically peaceful origins. In fact, they exclude themes that are Black or Indigenous people of color, LGBTQ+, and the Stonewall riots, as well as the AIDS epidemic. These are not included into the Thanksgiving holiday. Finally, the LGBTQ+ Stonewall riots and AIDS crisis is not included in many history curriculums. The use of whitewashed history text should be removed from school curriculums and replaced by scholarship centering the Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience, not only about the above people, but also written by those people. If we do not affirm this resolution, then we will be further robbing minorities of their voice, their history, and their culture. The texts that children use in school teach them not only about the world, but how to think about the world, and are so extremely one-sided that they have no choice but to side with the apparent one without doing their own other research. Now, I mentioned sex education earlier in the curriculum. This also is prevalent in today's debate. Abstinence-only education results in more pregnancies and STDs, and more importantly, more abortions. As we can see that people who do not learn from the sex education curriculum because they have been banned from their curriculum already simply have these higher rates. Sex education is also focused on heterosexual and cisgender relationships. Accurate, two-sided information would be more accessible to students with this resolution. This promotes a further understanding of minority narratives on topics like racism, sexism, xenophobia, and homophobia. Our second contention is that local governments are best equipped to make decisions regarding their districts rather than a third-party entity. Local governments and school boards are more familiar with the needs of the children and the abilities of the teachers. Not all teachers may be equipped to facilitate appropriate, thoughtful conversations about race or violence. In fact, some student populations may not even be able to handle reliving traumatic experiences through literature. So instead, we should replace the whitewashed American narrative with proper, full, and two-sided literature. Public schools should be given the autonomy to recreate a culture of tolerance. It is impossible to have a one-size-fits-all approach, and so it only makes sense that schools should have power over themselves. Local governments and school boards could effectively collaborate about the abilities of their facility, their faculty, and the needs of their students, giving them more control over curriculum and allowing the students to engage in more of their surrounding culture. There's a less burden on teachers and students alike, and they don't have to facilitate conversations that they're simply not equipped for. Our third contention is that banning offensive texts would create an inclusive school culture or a learning environment, as well as prevent children from learning hateful, outdated values. It is important here to think of the children. If any of you have children right now, think of them. Would you want them learning those outdated and hateful values? Is that something that you want them taught in the school curriculum because it is one-sided? They don't know the other side. As the school curriculum sits in classes such as American U.S. history, students are encouraged to voice their opinions. But with the diversity and uneasiness of offending people, we have shoved students into silence. This is something that we must teach today, to engage in civil discourse, talk about each other's culture, and more importantly, the history and how we can learn from it. The Smithsonian Magazine reports that a study of over 1,000 high school students over 1/3 of them reported feeling uncomfortable discussing one-sided topics in the classroom. They felt that because of the one-sidedness, they did not want to defend the status quo. They felt that they needed to stand up for the unrepresented opposing side, but was unsure how. If they're exposed to the two-sided literature, they at least know what they're going through and can help them to some capacity. Not banning offensive texts will provide an environment for hateful language and harassment to increase, which, for your children in school, is terrible, as well as promote learned biases and outdated values to impressionable school children with developing brains. Those people with children know that that is a very cautious experience. Today, we have discussed the various harms and implications of allowing offensive texts to remain in curriculum. The negative will attempt to challenge your decision by repainting a picture of what our students would encounter should they be exposed to full history, or perhaps the further miseducation of history. But what we must remain true to today is, are we willing to allow our future generations really to be exposed to the one-sided, whitewashed American narrative and not the whole truth? Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you. And now for the negative, will it be Zane or Jake?
It'll be me, Zane.
Thank you, Jane.
Perfect. Is anyone not ready? Cool. It is because Jake and I agree with Cameron's statement that, quote, we should engage in civil discourse and learn from history, and, quote, that we stand in negation of the resolution. Resolved, there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in the curriculum. Despite being the team in the negation of this resolution, we emphatically share the affirmative's underlying intentions to protect people, primarily children, from reading inappropriate material. However, every one of us has different opinions on what is and is not appropriate or offensive. We argue that banning certain books from curriculum is damaging to the marketplace of ideas. In other words, it protects students from exposure to counter viewpoints and new ideas. We think that there are numerous alternatives to a blanket ban that could all function simultaneously as a protection of our youth and as a protection of our freedoms in the spirit of intellectual development. To further clarify this debate, allow us to provide the following definitions of key terms. First, the First Amendment Encyclopedia defines book banning as, quote, a form of censorship occurs when private individuals, government officials, or organizations remove books from libraries, school reading lists, or bookstore shelves because they object to their content, ideas, or themes. Second, the California Court of Appeals delineates the word ban from restriction by stating that, quote, the ordinary meanings of restrict and regulate suggest a degree of control or restriction falling short of banning, prohibiting, forbidding, or preventing, end quote. Law firm Chapman Tripp corroborates this claim by stating that, quote, the Oxford Dictionary defines restriction as a limiting condition or measure. This can be compared with its definition of prohibition, which is the act of forbidding something. Prohibition, therefore, arguably refers to something different and more final than a restriction. A restriction limits while a prohibition forbids under all circumstances, end quote. This distinction is important for today's round because it is our contention that although banning books should never be done, restrictions are both permissible and favorable in some circumstances. We believe that while our opponents have reason to be concerned about vulgar or inappropriate materials being consumed by children, they have misplaced the power to determine a book's appropriateness for a child by allowing schools and other entities to decide instead of the parents or guardians of the children. Unfortunately, there is no objective standard for determining what is and is not worthy of discussion or critical engagement in the classroom. By advocating for banning of some books like the affirmative does, our colleagues are emphasizing one particular mode of thought while silencing others. This is antithetical to an education system that should encourage critical thinking on the biggest issues of our society. The core thesis that we are forwarding is that the imposition of information restraints in the form of banning text on free people is far more dangerous than any ideas that may be expressed in that content. Despite the affirmatives team attempt to say otherwise, we contend that banning books is a slippery slope. By allowing any books to be banned from a classroom, we open up the education system to political and social control that restricts the freedom of information that we all hold so dearly in this country. This has also been empirically proven. Calls for books to be banned have gone far beyond the criteria of whether or not there is sexual content or other age inappropriate content. Today, many calls for book banning arise from a different political or religious views that are heavily influenced by a school's administration. Should a conservative be allowed to ban a book simply because a liberal wrote it? Should an atheist administrator be able to ban a book that mentions God? Allowing individual educators and administrators the power to restrict the education of our children is dangerous and problematic. Jake and I value family agency to make this determination of whether or not a book is appropriate for the child. The ambiguity of the bright line that separates what is and is not appropriate can be made clear by the following acts. Anne Frank's diary was banned in the US because it was said to be too depressing for young readers. Fahrenheit 451 was banned in Mississippi for its anti-governmental advocacy. And likely the most ridiculous example is the banning of Where the Wild Things Are in many towns because a child psychologist had put out a statement that the author, quote, failed to understand the incredible fear it evokes in a child to be sent to bed without supper, end quote. I think we can all agree that going to bed without supper is not fun, but I don't see how reading such a book would harm a child. Many of the top 100 novels of the 20th century have been contested for some aspect of their content, and many of them have been banned in various communities. Banning these books deprives students of their cultural and historical knowledge that they possess and forecloses the possibility and ability to interact with differing perspectives. This shuts down the possibility for civic dialogue and risks erasing information that can help support youth. Have you ever heard of someone becoming smarter or more aware or more empathetic by reading less on a topic or social issue or a cosmological one? Free society is about the free sharing of ideas and information. Ideas are tested through conversation. And look, our colleagues in the affirmative today are right. Some content in books are far too inappropriate or offensive for young, immature children to handle. However, we argue that there are far better alternatives to a total ban that maintain the academic freedom of our society. Schools could include content warnings for books that have received criticism, or they can even place an age restriction based on content. Teachers can have parents sign permission slips to read a controversial text and provide alternative text that the parents disapprove. If there are select words in the text that are deemed offensive, those words can be redacted with footnotes explaining the reasoning behind that redaction to provide an opportunity for critical dialogue. This solution allows for a nexus of conversation between parents, teachers, community members on what text to include in the classroom without the onerous degradation of freedoms imposed by outright bans. The affirmative team may argue that these alternatives are bans, but recall our definition provided earlier that clearly distinguishes bans from restrictions. These restrictions can act as an intermediate space, a compromise, if you will, in that they prevent the harms of censorship that we have identified while also working actively to protect the well-being and academic growth of our nation's youth. If at the end of the round, you find yourself feeling uncomfortable with school administrators deciding what is and is not appropriate for your own child to read, we urge that you vote negative.
Thank you, Zane. Thank you, Zane. Let's move into the cross of round two, and let me open with kind of a question to the affirmative. I think in your second point, you suggested that local governments are best equipped to make these decisions. How would you distinguish between the hierarchy of education from early education? Many of you referenced what's appropriate for children, up through middle school, high school, and now culminating in your young adulthood as college students. And how would the affirmative envision those decisions arcing over time?
Yeah, so I like to think of school boards making these decisions mirrors the current legislative government that we have in place, right? So we have the federal government, which kind of sees the overall picture, but then the states are smaller governments or authority entities that have the freedom to adapt these laws and things as they wish, so long as it's within the bounds of the Constitution, these guidelines, right? So our envision for schools is going to be kind of this exact same thing. So we have certain texts that are just going to be, they are deemed racist, offensive, not beneficial in any way. And then those will be kind of not taught across the board. And the local governments are more equipped to handle the more specific, like day-to-day operations, because they are present and they are more familiar with the needs of their students.
If I may add on to that too, real quick. School boards receive back a lot of the testing information that students take, and so that really gives them the knowledge about what they already know, what they haven't been exposed to, but also they can take this information and analyze it with the culture of the surrounding students. And that's why we really believe that it's important that local governments make these decisions, is because the demographics as well as the culture that students are exposed to is not blanket across the country. Things change, and that's something that we're really emphasizing. And so to answer your question a little bit more specifically about how can we differentiate between the different levels of the education system, that's kind of where we're going to narrow it down even further, down into magnifying glass, and talk to the individual grade levels through the school board. Give them a time to meet and to talk about what they really feel that their students are struggling in, need exposure to, and quite the opposite, don't need exposure to.
Oh, you're muted.
Zane, Jake, do either of you have a perspective on the role of local government in this topic?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things. So first, I'll start with something that Cameron had said, alluding to the fact that there would be different rulings dependent on the context of that area. We find that confusing, considering that the affirmative says that their goal is to reinforce learned biases and get rid of texts that whitewash American narratives. But how does a text differ upon being whitewashing of a narrative, American narrative, over different places? We think it would be one thing, but I think that alludes to the fact of this a slippery slope in which different areas would make certain decisions that differ between districts, which just allows for a fluctuation without any bright line of what is or is not inappropriate material. And that's why we think that family agency is key here. We don't think that school boards are adequate or have any of the ability to make these decisions. We think that instead families should have that conversation for what is appropriate for their own child, because understandings of appropriateness differ so greatly between each family.
And we also think that we appreciate the sentiment that Alyssa and Cameron put forward, that they want more community and local level decision making. But one of the best benefits that we can find from having parents and families make these decisions in these contexts is that parents can have conversations with each other. Parents can have conversations with teachers, administrators, and it creates this community nexus of conversation that not only allows for that localization of the issue, but allows for each individual family to have autonomy over what their children are exposed to.
My response to that is twofold. First, when we talk about local governments compared to families, first of all, while I do agree with your sentiment that it is important for parents to be able to express their concerns about what their children are learning in school, that is very much something we should consider here. But the opinions of parents are going to come from arguably a more biased place than the opinions of the school board or governments. And so I think it got a little miscommunicated. So when we talk about these different levels of, school authority entities making these decisions, it is still going to be like one thing across the board. Like, we're going to say, hey, there are things that, there are these certain pieces that are just not beneficial to students whatsoever, but based on the needs of schools at the more specific level, because obviously geographical location, school district, grade level, those are all things that alter the students' needs, and we need to make that more specific. So it's still, they're experimenting within the bounds of the overall regulations already set, but they are choosing more specifically diving into topics that fit the needs of their students, but they're still doing it within that precedent that banning would be setting.
I would like to take a little bit of exception with something that was said there. I don't think that you can argue objectively that school boards are any less biased or know better than parents what is best for the education of their children. I think that's a really problematic standard to set, that government officials know better than families and individual communities what those students need. And so I think that that's really one of the big crux of the debate that we're trying to point out, is that we shouldn't let the government be the deciding factor in what our academic liberty means and what our ability to express ourselves and freely explore in academic spaces should mean.
On the contrary, like I said before, parents' opinions are going to be a lot more emotionally based. And while, yes, once again, I do agree with your sentiment, there is a rightful passion shown by parents about what their kids are learning in school, but the ones that are going to be better qualified to make that decision are going to be faculty of the school, people that are actually there with children while they are learning this stuff. Parents, the most parents know about what their kid is being taught in school is what their kid tells them from their perspective. So just something to keep in mind.
Why don't I invite either team to offer some commentary or further questioning as to other arguments that you heard?
I have a question for y'all. So your case would be implying that, so why, I guess my question is, why is it necessary, or why is it the most effective means of teaching kids about difficult topics? Like why is letting offensive text be put in a curriculum the most effective way to do that in your eyes?
I think there's a couple pieces to that. First, you have to turn towards the concept of the marketplace of ideas. And by completely banning these books, by removing them from view, you no longer expose these students to counter viewpoints in the text and in the ideas of those who put them forth originally. And we think that that's a really bad faith way to encourage discourse and dialogue on issues. We shouldn't be telling students that the way to handle issues is to completely ignore an opposing or countering view. Instead, we should show them and demonstrate to them how we can critically explore and challenge these texts in order to better further dialogue and better further our understanding of texts. I want to bring you back to something that Zane said in the opening speech. I don't know of a situation where someone got smarter or more nuanced or more empathetic on a topic because they just stopped reading the literature of the other side, even if they determined it to be offensive, and especially under the definition you provide that simply says offensive books are those that are inaccurate or incomplete. You allow then a school board to determine what is accurate, what is complete enough, what is accurate enough. That is an imposition of government ideals and socio-political ideals on what should be a free, open, and liberal educational system.
And responding to that, so when we say it's, you're saying that students being able to read more information about quote unquote opposing viewpoints. First of all, we're not talking about information that is opposing viewpoints to something that a school board might want to perpetuate in their curriculum. We're talking about things that are factually inaccurate, and it's still not going to be the school boards deciding whether this information is factually inaccurate or not. It's going to be literal fact checking and seeing if that information is objectively true. And so when you talk about how students are, nobody ever got smarter from reading less information, but is it really making the students smarter if the information they're reading is inaccurate?
I would pose a question back to you. How do you determine the truth value of a fictional text? How do you determine the truth value of things that aren't quantitatively black and white issues? And someone still has to then make that subjective decision for students, for families, and for communities in the affirmative world about what is too inaccurate or too incomplete. What if there's one statistic in a book that they misprinted and got wrong? Does that mean that that book should be banned completely from our library shelves? I still don't see how you have a specific metric. So I'm wondering, what is that exact process of fact checking? Who's in charge of that? How do you fact check values?
Fact checking values should actually be fairly easy. I think that if something promotes a racist rhetoric, then it should be deemed as inappropriate to be read by young, impressionable students in a classroom. When we talk about with fact checking, it's still going to be completely independent. So that's fine for nonfiction and all of that. And for fiction, it should be fairly easy to determine whether something is hateful or not. It shouldn't be this whole subjective debate. It should either something is very offensive for children and perpetuates outdated, racist, homophobic values, has topics in it that are not appropriate for young developing minds, that could cause actual damage to how they view the world. I don't think that that's a debate that's hard to prove.
If I would be able to tag on here to kind of the negative of the question to how can we fact check a value? I think some of it comes to reading what's outside of the text rather than looking between the covers. Look at who wrote it. We advocated for having people who are a part of the BIPOC community have their text represented. That's another way to ensure that both sides of the story are being told. And so that's kind of how we can prevent one-sided texts from only being taught in curriculum. Part of our case here is not only to ban the inaccurate and incomplete and uncritical texts, but to also include texts that further expose our children to the truth of the American history and how we came to where we are today. And part of that comes from simply looking at who wrote the book, who is it about, and whose name is on that cover.
Let's,
Additionally,
if I may, let's pivot a little bit. I think that was really rich discussion about that topic, about local jurisdictions. Whether it's examples in history or your own personal experience when banning books had a positive or negative effect on a society. Welcome some discussion about either your understanding of history or your own personal experience.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about some of my own personal experience. Throughout middle school and high school, I never received any sexual education. And that's because in both of my districts, there were a number of sex ed books and topics that were banned from conversation. And therefore, I never got key context on how to build healthy sexual relationships, on how to understand consent from my educational system. And so when the affirmative world talks about the fact that banning books allows us to build a healthier, safer, better and more robust sexual education system, what I've actually found in my experience is that book bans and bans on discussing topics in sexual education led to the complete removal of sexual education from my past history in both my middle school and my high school. And I'd argue that we can debate here what the best approach to sexual education is, but I think we can all agree that young students and young minds should get some form of education on that topic.
and in response to that, we have literally argued in our case that banning these offensive texts allows more room for comprehensive, accurate information like this, and it sounds like the NEG is agreeing with us in that aspect. And I would also like to point out that just because something is not taught in a classroom does not mean that students still can't look it up on their own time. It's just, we shouldn't be forcing students to sit in a classroom for 40 hours a week and learn about something that could be traumatic to their development. Or if they've had personal traumatic experiences with the subjects being talked about, they should not be forced to sit there and learn about it in a classroom, and they should especially not be forced to learn about it from a perspective that could be totally inaccurate. The NEG is also kind of trying to frame any vulgar content or any content that could be deemed controversial, quote unquote, as offensive. But when we talk about offensive, we're talking about factually inaccurate. We're talking racist, homophobic, things that perpetuate like hateful values. We're not talking about something that could merely just offend people. We are talking about things that have real consequences on children.
If I may, so in terms of how the affirmative is framing this issue thus far, it would seem that it is super easy and cut and dry to make these decisions. But in the negative case, we propose both Fahrenheit 451 and Frank's Diary and Where the Wild Things Are, in which those individuals decided that that was inappropriate. And obviously we could see that went far too down the road into allowing for a slippery slope of banning text just because they felt like it was not aligning with their own views or political beliefs and things of that sort. And then in terms of the affirmative's argument about personal traumatization, we certainly agree with that. We don't think that is a good thing to do, but we don't think a ban is the answer to that. Each person has their own experiences, and that's why we think restrictions that allow people to have alternative texts or other things that the school teacher deems as the right way to go about that, or the family deems as the right way to go about that, allows for those opportunities to occur where people can avoid being re-traumatized on things that are harmful to them.
This is an interesting discussion, and let's turn from the milieu of academics and in school to society at large. How do any of your thoughts and arguments adapt to a more societal context for this question versus in a curriculum aspect of academia?
Well, Judge, when we attend school as students, from at least ages, 5 to about 18, those are going to be some of the most crucial developmental years of tiny, young, impressionable brains, right? So school is the first place that we interact with other students, we learn how to make friends, we are exposed to what's going on in the world. It's where we start learning about history and all aspects of education. And so that's going to be the first place that has a lot of influence to shape our views of the world. And if we have an education system, and then they can correct me if I'm wrong, but they have not disputed this fact, we have an education system that portrays relatively inaccurate information, and that information can be racist, homophobic, any of the given isms that you would like to apply to it. So it's really important that we have an educational system where we're not teaching students that. And there are still ways to gain things from the other perspective than reading actual offensive texts that perpetuate these ideas. So then on a societal level, we become more aware of the issues we're facing, and we can ultimately fight that miseducation, because arguably that is the root of a lot of the way society manifests itself in that way.
I have 3 responses to that claim. First off, while we do admit that there are specific instances where educational curriculum or schools, have engaged in bad faith learning and education, we want to make it clear that we think in most cases, teachers and school curriculum are doing a good job in the status quo of preparing our students for their future lives. Partly because, as my second reason will go into, we allow students to be exposed to different viewpoints and different ideas. Because when you go out into the real world, there is no book ban on topics. There is no speech ban on things that make you feel uncomfortable. Sadly, in our world, we do have to confront, deal with, and have discourse about sensitive topics that may, make us feel uncomfortable, that may be, really vile. But I don't think that we can teach students that the best way to handle those situations is to just completely ban them, to ignore them. I don't think that that builds an education that is based on free expression, on academic liberty, and about civil discourse. But third, and finally, I think that we really here also need to look towards the broader societal impacts on families and communities. Because under the affirmative world, it is still the government telling families, communities, and individuals what they must read and what they can never read in schools, instead of allowing our broader social conversation, a nexus of conversation between parents, faculty, student members, community members, about the values that we want our education system to reflect, that we want our schooling to reflect, and that we want the texts in our schools to reflect.
If I can respond to that. First of all, banning offensive texts does not mean that we are banning the teaching of sensitive issues. It just means that there are far more effective ways to teach students about sensitive topics than actually reading offensive texts in the classroom. So I really do want to make that a point. And it sounds like the NEG agreed with our first contention that information taught in school is, to an extent, can be, school boards can, our curriculum really can teach inaccurate information that can lead to students developing a view of the world that is one way or the other. So why wouldn't we be able to just take these offensive rhetorics out of classrooms and allow us to talk about it in a more efficient way?
I have a question based off that. Why can't we reframe curriculum to include more voices of people of color without outright banning books from our curriculum? Why can't we add in new books, bring in new ideas and new perspectives? Why does it have to be that we are going to ban other perspectives?
We totally agree with you that books from people of color and more inclusive things should be included in our curriculum, but there are texts that are going to directly contradict these values. So if we're trying to include one thing, it would make sense that we shouldn't teach the direct factual contradictory thing, right? And it's also, your case sounds like it's assuming that conversations with parents are like more, they're better compared to interference like on a higher governmental level. But my question is, why can't these things happen at the same time? Because they certainly can. I think it's very important that we have both some kind of higher authority that can make these official decisions, but it's also important to listen to concerns of parents and other loved ones of the children. So it's not one or the other. These things can very much both happen in the apps world.
So let's turn it in one more general twist here. We're talking about texts in the context of presumably traditional textbooks, and yet we live in an environment where so much more information is shared through so many other channels, social media, video media, instant messaging, so on and so forth. It'd be interesting to hear you all discuss and debate the difference of the medium itself and whether what would be potentially deemed offensive, is it the same standard across all different platforms of media? Or is there different standard depending on the written word versus the disappearing word and social media and that kind of discourse? So let's throw that open for some discussion and debate.
That's an excellent opportunity for discussion. But I think that the main differential aspect between those two, between a written word and a disappearing word, is that you can move around and reorientate written words to be exactly what you want it to be. In textbooks, those go through so many forms of editing to make sure that they just get their point across. Rather, in text messages, you can't move that around. You can't eliminate one side with it still making perfect sense. You have to have both sides of the story for the point to actually come across. In a video, you can't make a one-sided video. You need to have the other point of view to ensure that the story is accurate. Within a text, in a traditional textbook, as you're kind of alluding to, is that those can be structured in a way you can easily jump from topic to topic, focusing only on one aspect of the story very easily. And as we've seen in many of our textbooks, that it's been done. They only focus on Lewis and Clark, for example. They don't focus on Native American genocide simply because they choose not to write about it. And that's something that is very important to notice. And so I think as we transition into a more digital age, that we may not necessarily have to worry about one-sided issues arising as much.
Right. I think that's an important thing that Cameron just touched on, that teachers can change the ways in which they teach a lesson from a textbook. There are different lessons, different chapters. But say in the affirmatives world, there is just one line of a chapter or one section of a chapter that they deem to be inappropriate. And that would lead to an entire ban of that textbook, even if there was fruitful discussions to occur there. The second thing we think is important is that in the world of social media, only the negative team, by not allowing for books to be banned, helps prepare students to be able to go into the real world, whatever that means, especially in the terms of academia. But looking at text messages, looking at social media posts and things of that sort, if they are ill-equipped to deal with and grapple with texts that are false and factually untrue, which the affirmative would want to get rid of completely, they would be unprepared to deal with that once they go back to their homes and deal with things of that sort, even after they graduate from their educations. So we think the negative world is the only way to best prepare students for that.
So in the apps, sorry, did you want to add?
Yeah,
No, go ahead, I interrupted.
I'd also say that in like video media and like social media and text messages, you still can definitely have a one-sided documentary. You can have a documentary that only interviews people who are for an issue instead of anyone who's also against an issue. So I don't think that the positionality of text or the one-sidedness of text is exclusively a problem in the written word. So I think that broader, in a more broad perspective, like all of these types of texts could have one-sided views, could have inaccurate claims, but it's still important for students to know how to interact with these texts and interact with these falsehoods.
So just because we're banning things that perpetuate a hateful rhetoric, once again, does not mean that students will not be learning about these things in school. And it does not mean that students they won't be just exposed to, like, they're going to be exposed to topics that they need to learn about. They're just not going to be exposed to them through these offensive texts. For just an example, we can learn about the problems in Nazi Germany without reading Mein Kampf, right? we are perfectly capable of using this space that we have in schools to teach students about these really sensitive topics, but just not with offensive, hateful text. That's our entire that's our entire case in point. So that does not mean that once students go out into the, like you said, quote unquote, real world, whatever that means, it doesn't mean that they won't know how to fact check and identify information or misinformation. Just means that they won't be explicitly reading hateful rhetoric in the classroom.
But in these situations, when you have the teacher ban the book and you provide the perspective that you believe to be accurate, aren't students being told what is accurate and inaccurate? So how would they then go out into the real world and determine in situations where they don't have a teacher standing right in front of them, telling them what is accurate or inaccurate, to actually determine the validity of values, the validity of claims, and engage in discourse on issues?
That would be precisely because students are still learning how to fact check, regardless of, like, literally my last response. They would still be learning about these issues. They're just not going to be learning about it with these specific offensive texts. We already know the problems we're facing. The neg paints it like, oh, if we ban these texts, we won't be able to learn what exactly the issues are with these topics. But we already know the issues with these topics, and it's that these topics are hateful. So we already know the problem with it. There's no need to give it more of a platform if we don't have to.
So this has been a thorny yet inspiring and motivating conversation for sure, and you've all done such a wonderful job, both in preparation and off the cuff responding. I think it's time that we go to our close now, and 5 to 6 minutes apiece. And I believe we will, Alyssa, start with you for the affirmative.
1 second, just gonna get my timer ready. Starting time now. First and foremost, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our opponent, our judge panel, and anybody that might be watching at home for participating in a very, very lively debate today. Both teams are here because schools have a duty to protect their students. There are texts out there that perpetuate nothing but harmful content to students. Racial stereotypes, abuse, discrimination, and so much more. These texts are inappropriate for school environments and ultimately do not have any benefit to young developing minds that are our students. And there are much more effective ways to teach about sensitive topics than allowing these hateful texts to be taught in a classroom. The classroom, like we've discussed, is an extremely important place. It's our first exposure to other children, to knowledge, and it ultimately has the first impression and shapes the way we view the world. Students spend the majority of their formative years in a classroom for 40 hours a week, so it's only natural that we should be deeply concerned about what they're learning. The root of problems in today's political climate, racism, sexism, and more, come from the biased ideals that we are subliminally taught in the classroom. Now, our American education system has become one that suppresses the history of racial minorities, religious minorities, LGBT plus movements, and women's history. It is one that teaches a very one-sided account of things and can lead to young, impressionable students making decisions before researching both sides. Now, the negation has tried to paint a picture that banning would only result in censoring difficult topics and that these topics are essential to be talked about in the classroom. But that's really not the case, because censoring an offensive text is not the same as censoring the entire topic as a whole. It is vital that students are taught about these things, but we disagree with the methods which they should be taught. When we talk about offensive texts, we talk about things that are racist or purely hateful in some way, shape, or form, not just something that could be considered controversial or taboo, like the Ned claims. In their world, we'd be giving a platform to these kinds of things that are purely harmful, when there's really no need for us to give these things attention in the first place. They also claim that allowing offensive text to be taught in schools would only allow for the free exchange of ideas and be discussed, but why should we force students who may have trauma related to these topics, why should we force students to sit down and listen to an offensive rhetoric that confirms existing biases about whatever groups they may be a part of. That takes a detrimental effect on our students that really it impacts a lot of our society as a whole as they grow up. They say that parents' opinions are better and that we should not trust the government to make decisions, but rather increase the needs of our families and parents and all that. And we do agree. We think that parents' contributions are extremely important because it is their kids being enrolled in school, but there's no reason why these things can't happen at the same time. When we have that universal code of, okay, this is what we can teach and this is what we should conduct, and then smaller jurisdictions are able to kind of malate that for their specific needs of their specific community, that's the part where we can take parents' opinions into account. But we shouldn't be teaching students texts that paint racial biases or any other isms that you want to take into account. We shouldn't be teaching students, they shouldn't be painted in any sort of positive light. We should not be giving a platform to these things. And throughout this debate, we've established that offensive texts promoted outdated values and learned biases, which our opponent agrees with, specifically because they exclude things like racism, sexism, xenophobia, or sex education. Education has constantly evolved on every other front. I'm sure all of us have tried to help a person younger than us with a math problem, and we got stuck because it's not the way we were taught in school, right? So every aspect of education is constantly evolving, and there is no reason why our values would not be an exception. A vote for the affirmation is a vote to protect our students and foster a safe learning environment. This resolution is not just about monitoring school curriculums, it is about the quality of life and education for our students. They're the next generation, and we need to raise them in a world of inclusiveness. If you care at all about taking tangible steps to dismantle these promoted biases, you will vote on the affirmation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. Jake, we turn to you.
All right. Well, I also want to extend my thank you to the affirmative side for a fantastic debate. It's awesome to engage in civil discourse here today, and I want to thank all the judges. But I think what today's round really comes down to is 3 key issues why you're going to be siding with the negation and voting with us at the end of this round. First, there are better solutions to all-out bans that do not as much disrupt the marketplace of ideas by completely removing books and topics from our curriculum. The affirmative side continues to ask that we see issues and learn about issues from both sides, from multiple angles, and include more diverse texts. But in order to learn about an issue from multiple sides, from multiple angles, we not only need to learn and understand those more diverse texts, but we also need to understand the flaws, issues, and misconceptions put forth in those texts that may be problematic and may be against American values. Issues aren't black and white. They aren't perfectly racist or not racist. There are a number of things that require civil discourse and critical engagement, which we can't do when we only get one side of the story and never learn how to properly fact-check claims, how to properly research value-based arguments, which is what would happen when you blanket ban something from our schools. If we want to protect kids from trauma, allow them to opt out. If we want to protect community values, allow parents to not sign the permission slip that says their child can read this offensive book, but give each and every family the autonomy to make that decision, which leads to my second point, that voting for the negation is voting for the rights of parents, for the rights of families, and for the rights of communities to decide what is put in front of their students. They continue to tell you that there is going to be some objective standard by which the school board will decide whether something is true or not, or whether a book with values is good or not. But that denies the autonomy of individuals. That denies further discourse and discussion. But in the negative world, by going for these alternatives that encourage discussion between parents and teachers, parents and students, teachers and administrators, and all of those individuals and the broader community, we actually create a more fruitful discussion, a more fruitful civil discourse about these issues and just why some of the aspects of our education system may be invaluable. Local government is not better than parents at deciding what is best for their kids. Government impositions on free liberty and academic liberty are not the answer to these problems. That only invites socio-political rhetoric to be able to dominate what our children get exposed to and what they learn about. But third, and finally, understand the slippery slope of government censorship that may continue from this if you affirm today's legislation or resolution, excuse me. While the affirmative tells you that they're only going to do it in these very specific instances, they tell you that they're going to ban offensive books, offensive material, things they deem to be inaccurate or incomplete. At the end of the day, they're allowing the government to unilaterally make that decision. And as we've shown you in our case, whether it's Fahrenheit 451 or Where the Wild Things Are, governments can impose wildly ineffective and onerous standards on communities and classroom environments. And we should not let this danger of censorship continue. The AF promises this won't happen, but in the real world, they can't do that. You and I can't ensure that each and every administrator at each and every school won't abuse this governmental power to restrict academic liberty and free expression. But finally, on the subject of the dangers of government censorship, I want to turn to an important topic brought up by our moderator in the questioning portion of today's round. The inclusion of other text, whether they be video instruction materials, whether they be social media materials, other types of media, by allowing the government to say what texts of all kinds can enter the school environment, you also invite the ability for the government to begin regulating what types of text messages students can send on campus, what kind of social media posts are inaccurate or incomplete and therefore must be banned from campus, what types of videos people can watch during their recess and free time. We would argue that this is a grave violation of individual liberty and individual autonomy. Don't let the government become the censor. Let conversations about these texts become a nexus for community conversation between parents, faculty, students, and administrators. Stand with us and negate. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much. I think I can speak for all the judges in saying that the energy and the passion and the intellect and the conviction that all of you have brought to your arguments and your position, seeing what you agree, finding common ground around certain things. And there was a lot of common ground here. And I think that speaks well to, both positions and all four of you. This is a hard decision. And I want to give our judges ample time to complete their scorecards. So we congratulate you for all that you've done and all that you've shared with us, and wish you the very, very best of luck. Well done. Very well done.
Thank you so much for judging.
Thank you. And we'll all sign off now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.